The year 2020, I think, was a very productive year for Afghanistan in terms of moving forward, particularly when it comes to peace and stability. After more than 19 years of bloodshed, we finally saw some movement towards stability with the signing of the US-Taliban peace agreement. Now, while many have rightfully criticized the agreement for the flaws that it has, whether we like it or not, this was and is the only way forward in trying to achieve peace and stability in Afghanistan. The agreement in itself, as you're all aware, has four major components. And unfortunately, those major components of the agreement have not been fulfilled to date. For example, let's start with the first one, the ceasefire. Till date, fighting continues between the Taliban and the government in Kabul. Now, while there have been calls for the Taliban to push towards a reduction of violence and then ultimately achieve a ceasefire, unfortunately, this has not happened. And I think this has been one of the flaws of the agreement, because the agreement should have only been signed once the Taliban had agreed to a ceasefire. And unfortunately, they hadn't. So this is something that needs to be focused on. The other was, of course, the release of prisoners, and we saw a number of hurdles in that, but eventually, some movement was made, and majority of the prisoners have been released, although a couple are left, and that again is a sticking point between Kabul and, of course, the Taliban. The other was the withdrawal of foreign forces, and this is something that the Taliban have been demanding, from day one, since they were overthrown in 2001, that there has to be a complete withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghanistan. Now, while there has been a reduction of troops, we've recently seen a statement from the new administration in the US saying that they will continue with the troops for the time being. But I think, it is important to note here that while the Taliban have always been saying that they want the withdrawal of, foreign forces, at the same time, Abbas Tanakzai has said this on several occasions, particularly in the Moscow talks, where he said that the Taliban would be open to some sort of presence of the US in Afghanistan, provided it was peacekeeping or development. So this clearly shows that the Taliban are open to some sort of US presence, but on their terms. So this is another interesting point. And lastly, while a lot has been spoken about the future of Afghanistan, to date, little or no discussion has taken place on what kind of a future political setup we are going to see in Afghanistan. And I think this is very important, and this should have been discussed, or rather it should have been a principal point in the US-Taliban agreement, which was overlooked. And I think this is one of the reasons why now the government in Kabul, of course, doesn't accept what is happening, because there are many question marks. And lastly, another important factor that should have been given more weightage was the intra-Afghan talks. Now remember that, regional countries and the US can only do so much. At the end of the day, achieving a compromise and reaching, a mutually acceptable agreement for both parties can only be achieved when the Taliban and Kabul want it. And that can only happen through intra-Afghan talks. And unfortunately, as we have seen, intra-Afghan talks, it has been a very, very tricky process where these two parties have not been really able to overcome the minor issues, let alone the talks. The talks haven't even started. They've been arguing, or they haven't been able to agree on very, minimal factors such as the structure of the talks and the timings and whatnot. So I think unless and until both Kabul and the Taliban do not reach a compromise, no matter what regional countries or the Americans do, achieving peace will be very, very difficult. And I have said this time and again that while a lot of focus is laid on the external challenges to the peace process and external spoilers, I think the biggest impediment to the peace process is in fact internal challenges and internal spoilers. And therefore, I think more focus needs to be laid on national reconciliation and national reintegration, and questions and issues like social healing. These are, elements that have been missing from the Afghan equation. Do remember, the country has been in turmoil for more than, just now, if we look at it, 3 decades, and I'm not talking about what happened in the 70s. So I think focus really needs to be laid on internal challenges to the peace process and, of course, intra-Afghan talks. And I don't mean just by meeting in Doha, by actually talking about issues where both sides will have to learn to be patient and they will have to learn to compromise on their sticking points. And this is a factor that I think is important. It's overlooked. And while the new Biden administration can put as much pressure on as they want to, at the end of the day, if the Afghans want peace, they will have to achieve it together. That is Kabul and the Taliban and the other factions together.
All right, there is a lot being discussed, being talked about that how Biden team is going to take this peace process and what are the things Biden is going to do.
Look, I think first of all, it's too premature to say what Biden exactly is going to do in Afghanistan. But if we go back to his election campaign, and we can determine from that what his policies were. First of all, it's going to be a review process of what has been achieved so far in the peace process and what the situation is in Afghanistan. Now, if you look at what has been achieved, yes, an agreement was signed between the Taliban and the former US government headed by President Trump, but no particular headway has been made. But at the same time, I think then we should also look at the fact that whether good or bad or whether slow or not, but Kabul and the Taliban are in fact engaging. And I think that's a positive development. The fact that, it's taken more than 19 years for these two parties to sit face to face is in itself an achievement. So I think the Biden administration is really going to focus on how these talks unveil, and also another major factor that will determine, I think, Biden's policy towards Afghanistan will be based on the Taliban stance towards violence. Are they going to push for a reduction, which I think would be a positive step? And I think here, let me just mention that the Taliban, I think, if they reduce violence, they should not do this as a means of weakness or as a means of surrender, but rather to put themselves as the more responsible stakeholder that is interested in the future of Afghanistan. And I think by reducing violence and moving towards the talks, they could secure for themselves a place in the future Afghan polity. So I think, as I just said, a lot is going to depend on how the Taliban, react. Or
where do you think Pakistan is going to be? Is the role still same for Pakistan? Do more thing and all?
Look, I personally feel that while the peace process is a very important, a component of the Pak-Afghan relationship, it shouldn't be the sole factor. For far too long, security, the peace process and stability in Afghanistan has dictated the Pak-Afghan relationship. And as we have seen, it has been very detrimental, because when anything goes wrong, whether it's in the peace process or in terms of violence, you have accusations coming from Kabul and the Americans. Now, here it is important to understand that yes, Pakistan has publicly as well as privately, tried to use its influence on the Taliban to push for the peace process. And we have seen the Taliban has not only signed an agreement with the Americans, but they are engaging with Kabul in intra-Afghan talks. But you see, one has to draw the line. Pakistan can only do so much. At the end of the day, if peace is meant to be achieved, it can only be achieved when both the Taliban as well as Kabul learn to negotiate and learn to compromise and accommodate each other's demands. Pakistan cannot do that. Pakistan cannot deliver peace. Pakistan can only push and support the process. And here I feel that, Pakistan, while in the beginning, Pakistan may have had a vague stance, it has been ambiguous, and Pakistan has been criticized for it. Now, Pakistan has solely said that it will support the peace process and it will do anything to push for peace and stability in Afghanistan. But it is not going to dictate, and it cannot dictate. And as you have seen, Pakistan now has no favorites. It openly says, the government, that we are open to all the different political factions in Afghanistan. And whoever achieves peace in, becomes or is a part of the government, that is acceptable to Pakistan. So Pakistan will continue to push both the government of Kabul as Pakistan काबुल के साथ भी engage कर रहा है. In fact, different political factions के साथ engage कर रहा है. अगर आप देख ले, within the past 2 years, President Ghani भी आया है, Dr. Abdullah भी आया है, फिर हमने Ustaz Khalili भी आया है, and different political factions. Pakistan basically wants to have a relationship with all the different political and ethnic factions of Afghanistan में. हमारे कोई favorites नहीं हैं. ठीक है जी. और at the same time, میں یہ ضرور کہوں گی کہ وائل دا پیس پروسیس بہت امپورٹنٹ اور اہم کمپوننٹ ہے پاک افغان ریلیشن شپ میں، اٹ شوڈنٹ بی دا ڈٹرمننگ فیکٹر. اگر آپ نے دیکھا ہو پچھلے 19 ایئرس میں اٹ ہیز آلویز بین دا سیکورٹی اور دا پولیٹیکل اور دا پیس پروسیس ان افغانستان جو پاک افغان ریلیشنس کو ڈکٹیٹ کیا ہے، اور یہ ڈیٹریمنٹل ہوا ہے دونوں ملکوں کے لیے، کیونکہ جب بھی کوئی اچھا ہو جاتا ہے تو یو ہیو پریزز فرام واشنگٹن اینڈ کابل، لیکن جس دن کچھ ایک بام بلاسٹ ہو جاتی ہے یا پیس پروسیس میں کچھ غلط ہو جاتے ہیں تو آل دا بلیم اینڈ اونس کمز آن پاکستان. دیئرفور اٹ از امپورٹنٹ کہ پاکستان سپورٹ کرے پروسیس کو اور ڈکٹیٹ نہ کرے، اور پاکستان کو کوئی انٹرسٹ بھی نہیں ہے ڈکٹیٹ کرنے میں. دا پیس پروسیس شوڈ ناٹ ڈکٹیٹ دا ریلیشن شپ، یہ ایک بہت ضروری اور امپورٹنٹ نقطہ ہے. اینڈ آئی تھنک دونوں ملک اور دونوں گورنمنٹ شوڈ فوکس آن ایکسپینڈنگ اپنا بائی لیٹرل ریلیشن شپ. دیکھیے جی، ہماری ریلیشن شپ افغانستان کے ساتھ صرف پیس پروسیس اور اسٹیبلٹی پہ تو نہیں ہے. وی ہیو اے بارڈر ود دیم، وی نیڈ ٹو فوکس آن ٹریڈ، کنیکٹیوٹی، بارڈر مینجمنٹ، پیپل ٹو پیپل کانٹیکٹس. دیکھیں ہماری ان کے ساتھ ابھی ایک واٹر شیئرنگ اگریمنٹ بھی نہیں ہے جو ان دا فیوچر ضروری ہوگا. Therefore we need to expand the contours of this bilateral relationship. Yes, peace process, stability important ہے، لیکن it should not be the sole factor. کیونکہ ایٹ دی اینڈ آف دا ڈے اگر اچھا ہوگا پیس پروسیس میں پاکستان ویلکمز اٹ. انفارچونیٹلی اگر اس طرح پروگریس نہیں ہوتا دیٹ شوڈ ناٹ افیکٹ پاکستان اینڈ افغانستان's bilateral relationship. یہ ایک بہت ضروری نقطہ ہے where both the countries should focus on this.